September 9th, 1943. The war in the Mediterranean had taken a shocking turn. On this day, the Italian battleship Roma, pride of the Regia Marina, led a formation of warships on what was supposed to be a routine sortie. Within hours, however, Roma would become the first battleship in history sunk by a precision-guided bomb. In a matter of minutes, a revolutionary new weapon turned the Italian flagship into a burning, broken wreck. Explore how Roma was built and what she represented, the complex events leading to her final voyage, the harrowing details of the German Fritz X bomb attack, and the legacy that followed. Roma was conceived during a naval arms race in the 1930s, as Italy sought to assert power in the Mediterranean. Italian dictator Benito Mussolini had initially hesitated to invest in new battleships, but by 1934, he authorized the Littorio-class battleships to counter potential threats from France and Britain. Roma was the third of this Littorio class, following her sister ships Littorio and Vittorio Veneto. Her keel was laid down on September 18, 1938, and she was launched on June 9, 1940. After fitting out, Roma was officially commissioned on June 14, 1942. As a Littorio-class battleship, Roma was among the most modern warships of her day. She stretched about 789 feet and at full load displaced roughly 45,000 tons. Powered by 4 steam turbines delivering 128,000 shaft horsepower, she could surge to 30 knots despite her massive size. Her main battery featured 9 381mm 15-inch guns mounted in 3 triple turrets, 2 forward and 1 aft. Roma's secondary armament, 12 152mm guns, and smaller 90mm and 37mm anti-aircraft guns, among other weapons. The ship was protected by belt armor up to 350mm and reinforced decks. In short, Roma was built to dish out and take punishment in equal measure. Italian naval engineers also incorporated improvements into Roma's design based on earlier experience. Compared to her older sisters, she carried additional anti-aircraft guns, 32 instead of 24, to bolster her defense against air attack. Every aspect of Roma's construction, from her robust armor to her high speed, reflected Italy's hope that these battleships would command the Mediterranean. When Roma joined the fleet in 1942, Italy's naval war was already on the defensive. Early in World War II, the Italian Navy had looked impressive on paper, a mix of new battleships, cruisers, and numerous submarines. But reality proved harsher. Italy suffered setbacks, such as the daring British air raid on Taranto in 1940, which crippled several older battleships, and the defeat at Cape Matapan in 1941. By 1942, severe fuel shortages kept most heavy ships in port, limiting training and operations. In fact, by the end of 1942, only the 3 new Littorio-class battleships, including Roma, were fully operational, while Italy's older battleships were laid up due to lack of fuel. This meant that Roma and her sisters represented virtually the entire effective naval force of Italy, but even they had little opportunity to engage the enemy. Allied forces were closing in on Italy from the south. In November 1942, the Allies landed in North Africa, and by May 1943, Axis resistance there had collapsed. The Allies next set their sights on Sicily, invading the island in July 1943. Under growing pressure, Italy's fascist regime began to falter. In late July 1943, Mussolini was deposed, and Marshal Pietro Badoglio formed a new government that secretly started negotiating an armistice with the Allies. Throughout this period, Roma remained at anchor, unable to alter the course of events. Fuel scarcity and Allied air supremacy made any large-scale naval sortie extremely risky. The Allies were keenly aware of the Italian fleet and targeted it with air raids. In Naples and La Spezia, another major naval base, bombing raids struck at Italy's proud ships. On June 5, 1943, American B-17 flying fortresses raided La Spezia. Roma and Vittorio Veneto were each hit by 2 heavy bombs. Roma survived near misses and a hit without exploding internally, though the blasts caused significant leaking and flooding in her forward compartments. Another raid later in June struck Roma again, damaging her stern and turrets, after which she sailed to Genoa for repairs. By mid-August 1943, Roma was repaired and back at La Spezia, just in time for the fateful events of September. As summer turned to fall, Italy stood at a crossroads. The new government was secretly preparing to switch sides. On September 3rd, 1943, Italy signed the Armistice with the Allies, agreeing to cease hostilities against them. The plan included a crucial demand. The Italian fleet was to sail to Allied-controlled ports to prevent the ships from falling into German hands. However, this surrender was announced to the world only on September 8, 1943, catching many off guard, including much of the Italian Navy. The announcement threw Italy's military into chaos. German forces, feeling betrayed, immediately launched Operation AXA, rushing to occupy Italy and neutralize its military assets. The Italian fleet suddenly faced a dangerous dilemma: obey the order to sail to Allied ports, risking German attack and unsure of Allied intentions, or remain and possibly be seized or destroyed by the Germans. This was the tense backdrop as Admiral Carlo Bergamini, commander of the main battle fleet, prepared to make a historic decision. In the early hours of September 9th, 1943, the very next day after the armistice announcement, Admiral Bergamini, commander of the main battle fleet, quietly led the Italian fleet out of La Spezia harbour. The fleet was substantial: 3 battleships, Roma, Italia, and Vittorio Veneto, 3 cruisers, and 8 destroyers, among others. Roma, as flagship, headed the column with Bergamini in command. Officially, Bergamini had told the local German liaison that the fleet was departing to attack Allied ships off Salerno, where Allied forces had just launched an invasion of mainland Italy. This ruse kept the Germans complacent for the moment. Initially, Bergamini intended to rendezvous at La Maddalena, a naval base on the Sardinian coast. La Maddalena was supposed to serve as a temporary haven. The fleet set course for Sardinia accordingly. As Roma and her accompanying ships steamed west, they were joined en route by additional cruisers from Genoa that augmented their formation. For many of Roma's crew, this was actually the first time they sailed into open sea expecting possible combat. A mix of anxiety and hope filled the air. The moral dilemma was acute. Until yesterday, their enemy was the Allies. Today, their former German ally was a potential threat. Most sailors were still unaware of the full scope of the armistice terms, and worried about what awaited them if they surrendered in an Allied port. By midday on September 9th, the Italian fleet approached Sardinian waters. However, events on land forced a sudden change of plans. Not long before the fleet's expected arrival, word came through that German forces had occupied La Maddalena ahead of them. The planned stop was now impossible. Admiral Bergamini reacted swiftly. At about 1:40 p.m., upon learning of La Maddalena's fall, he ordered the entire fleet to reverse course and head for the open sea and onward to Allied-controlled areas. The new destination signalled by Italian Naval Command was Malta or, possibly Beaune, an Allied-held port in North Africa. The fleet swung north of Sardinia, near the Strait of Bonifacio, and then toward the southwest. By around 2 p.m., the ships could see Asinara Island off Sardinia's northern coast. Unbeknownst to the Italians, the Luftwaffe was already in pursuit. German commanders, enraged by Italy's defection, had resolved to strike the fleeing fleet. From airfields in southern France, a squadron of 15 bombers of Kampfgeschwader 100 took off, each carrying a single top-secret anti-ship weapon. As the Italian ships altered course, high above them, German planes began shadowing the fleet at a distance. Italian lookouts spotted aircraft tracking them, but, at first, no one opened fire. The reason was a tragic misunderstanding. The planes were so high and kept their distance, leading Admiral Bergamini to assume they might be Allied aircraft, providing cover as promised by the Allies. After all, conventional bombing from such altitude was unlikely to hit moving warships. It made little tactical sense to the Italians that enemy bombers would attack from that height. Thus, for a crucial window of time, Roma's anti-aircraft gunners held their fire while unknown danger literally loomed overhead. At approximately 3 p.m. on September 9th, the uneasy calm was broken. The German bombers began their attack run. These bombers carried the Fritz X, officially known as the Ruhrstahl FX 1400, a pioneering guided bomb that the world had never seen in combat until that moment. Unlike normal gravity bombs, the Fritz X was a precision-guided munition, essentially an armor-piercing bomb with radio controls and fins that allowed a bombardier to steer it in flight. Dropped from high altitude, it could reach nearly the speed of sound as it plunged, giving it enormous kinetic energy. It was designed to penetrate thick armor before exploding deep inside a ship. In simple terms, Fritz X was a revolutionary ship killer. Each bomber had a bombardier who, upon release of the weapon, would track a burning flare on the bomb's tail and guide it via a joystick-like controller, correcting its course all the way to impact. The Italians, like all navies then, had no experience with such a threat. They were looking for traditional level bombing or torpedo attacks, not radio-controlled dive bombs from extreme altitude. Around 3:30, sirens blared on the Italian ships as the realization dawned that those high-flying planes were hostile. The sky sparkled with anti-aircraft bursts as Roma and her consorts belatedly opened fire, but it was largely futile. The Germans were well out of effective anti-aircraft range. Shortly after, the first Fritz X bombs began to fall. At about 3:36, one of the German glide bombs narrowly missed the battleship Littorio, exploding in the sea near her stern with a massive plume of water. The near miss sent shockwaves through Littorio, but she remained largely intact. Then, minutes later, disaster struck Roma. At around 3:50, Roma was rocked by a direct hit. A Fritz X slammed into her, reportedly on the starboard side amidships. The hit punched through deck armor and tore through multiple decks before detonating just under the hull, beneath Roma's keel. The effect was devastating. A huge explosion erupted from the bottom of the ship, blasting open her hull. Water gushed into Roma's aft engine room and 2 boiler rooms almost instantly. Power lines shorted out amid showers of sparks, and electrical fires broke out throughout the rear of the vessel. The battleship's propellers fell silent as power failed, and Roma, now crippled, began to fall behind the rest of the formation. Black smoke billowed from Roma's stern as crewmen fought the fires and struggled to understand what had hit them. Many sailors had been killed or injured in the aft sections, and damage control teams raced to keep the ship afloat. But the respite was brief. Just after 4 p.m, a second Fritz X found its mark on Roma, this time with fatal effect. The bomb struck further forward on the starboard side near one of the forward engine rooms. It penetrated deep and detonated amidships, likely in or adjacent to the forward engine machinery spaces. The blast ignited roaring fires and caused heavy flooding in the magazines of Roma's second main turret and a nearby secondary gun magazine. At 4:02, Roma was torn apart by a colossal internal explosion. The magazine of turret number 2 erupted in a fireball, blowing the 150-ton turret clean off the ship. Eyewitnesses later recalled seeing the huge gun turret lifted into the air and thrown overboard. The blast obliterated the forward superstructure of the ship. The bridge and command center were instantly destroyed. Both Admiral Bergamini and Captain Adone died at that moment, along with nearly everyone else on the bridge. Crew not killed by the blasts were now struggling in a hellish environment: smoke, flame, twisted metal, and collapsing decks. Many of the survivors from the initial hit were grievously burned or injured in this second strike. Within minutes of the second hit, it was clear Roma was mortally wounded. The great battleship lingered for a short while, her bow dipping deeper into the Tyrrhenian Sea and a heavy starboard list developing. At around 4:12, as tons of seawater rushed into her breached hull, Roma capsized to starboard, breaking in two amid the continued explosions and flooding. By 4:15, less than 45 minutes after the first bomb struck, Roma slipped beneath the waves and was gone. The human cost was staggering. Of Roma's crew and additional personnel, numbering around 1,850 to 2,000 men, only a few hundred survived. The official inquiry after the sinking reported 596 survivors and 1,253 men lost. However, later research pointed out that about 2,021 people were actually on board, including extra staff officers such as Admiral Bergamini's staff, meaning roughly 1,393 perished. Survivors of Roma found themselves in oil-slicked, debris-strewn waters, many struggling with burns or other injuries. Amid the horror, the remaining Italian ships initially had to keep moving, fearing further air attacks, but soon rescue efforts began. Italian destroyers and accompanying vessels cautiously returned to the scene once it was clear the Luftwaffe had withdrawn. They plucked what survivors they could from the water. With Italy now effectively out of the war and the fleet in transit to surrender, the Italian ships sought safe haven for the wounded. They sailed to the nearest neutral territory, Spain. The rescued crew of Roma were transported to Porto Mahon on the Spanish island of Minorca, where they were interned for the remainder of the war. Neutral Spain thus became an unlikely refuge for the men who endured Roma's final moments. Meanwhile, the rest of the Italian fleet, now under the command of the senior surviving officer, Admiral Romeo Oliva, continued toward Allied-controlled waters. The loss of the flagship and its admiral in such a horrific fashion was a tremendous shock, but the remaining ships had to carry out their orders. They eventually reached Malta, and some to North Africa, surrendering to the Allies as per the Armistice conditions. News of Roma's destruction slowly reached Italy and the world. For the Italians, it was a bitter pill, their proudest battleship, gone not in a glorious fleet action, but while trying to change sides and save itself from its former ally. German propaganda trumpeted the event as proof of their vengeance and the power of their new weapons. In the confusion of Italy's 1943 surrender, Roma's loss stood out as a symbol of the high price paid during those chaotic days. The sinking of Roma resonates as more than just a naval loss. It marked a turning point in naval warfare technology and a poignant chapter in Italy's World War II saga. First and foremost, Roma's demise at the hands of the Fritz X was the dawn of precision-guided munitions in naval combat. Never before had a battleship been defeated by a guided bomb. The Fritz X would go on to wreak havoc in the weeks after Roma's sinking, striking and badly damaging the US cruiser, Savannah, and the Royal Navy battleship Warspite during the Salerno invasion, heralding a new era where air power and electronics would overshadow the gun-heavy battleships of old. For Italy, the loss of Roma was both a strategic and a psychological blow. Although by September 1943, the Italian fleet's role in the war was already limited, Roma had represented a last vestige of Italian naval strength and honour. Her sinking meant that Italy would join the Allied cause deprived of its flagship. On a human level, the tragedy took the lives of over 1,300 Italian sailors and officers at a moment when Italy was hoping to minimise bloodshed by exiting the war. In the long run, Roma's sinking underscored the vulnerabilities of battleships in the age of air power. It validated the shift in naval strategy towards aircraft carriers and guided weapons. A few planes with the right weapon could deliver a knockout punch from the relative safety of the skies. The story of Roma highlights the chaotic reality of Italy's 1943 armistice, a once ally turning on its partner with lethal effect. It also captures a moment of rapid technological change. the first deployment of a guided bomb against a ship, which became a glimpse of how effective precision bombing technology could be. Roma's legacy is one of bravery amid turmoil and confusion, and a symbol of how swiftly the tides of war can shift and turn.